Are you interested in learning to paint a landscape or a still life more successfully, especially when you're looking at the shadows and the shading and creating the value? Hi, I'm Barry Techmine, and hopefully this class will teach you a few things that'll help you be more successful when you're doing just that. And that is creating shading in landscapes and in still life. When painting watercolor, knowing how to create shadows and different values is an essential technique. This program is going to focus on how to shade objects in a still life, as well as creating shadows in a landscape. Learn the importance of doing an underpainting, creating contrast using the same color, and using glazing to build up the object color. And in our program today, we're going to begin by looking at the supplies used when doing shading. We're going to do an activity where we're going to paint spheres and create shading on those spheres. We're going to do watercolor shadow colors and what colors mixed together make the best shadows. We're going to use cast shadows in a landscape. And then we're going to use an underpainting in a still life. And finally, we will review and wrap up. Let's begin by looking at some of the paper formats that I use. This is an Etcher sketchbook. Probably my favorite sketchbook. I like the rubber band that goes around the outside to keep things together. I also like the thickness of the paper. This is 140 pound paper, 100% cotton, and it has a little bit of a texture to it. It is cold press. As you can see, I use it frequently, especially for my demonstrations. You might recognize some of these paintings later on in the video. And this is the paper format I use probably the most. It is Arches. Again, it is 140 pound. This is cold press, which means it has a bit of a texture to it. And this is the tablet form. This is the easiest probably to tear out and utilize. But you can also get this in large sheets if you would so desire. And then there's also other weights. This is 140 pound and it's also, this is hot pressed. So hot pressed is much smoother. Smoother paper allows you to use ink a little bit better. And when I'm doing illustrations, this is probably the format that I use the most. Now let's talk paint brushes. I have a variety of paint brushes that I use. This one is probably one that I use a lot though. This is a Princeton Heritage number 6. And it is a round brush. You can tell it's a round brush by looking at where the ferrule is at the top and seeing that it's a nice round area there, and that the end will come to a nice point. This is my favorite brush though. This is the Silver Black Velvet, and this is a number 10, which is about a medium brush. Does the same thing. You will notice the point on the end and how nicely that works. It's great for painting details and for washes. This is also a Silver Black Velvet, but this one is a flat brush. You'll notice it's a 1/2 inch. And then I also have, this is a rigger brush. It has a 1 on it. These come in different sizes as well. A rigger brush has a longer brush area. This allows you to do some nice work on details as well as on like tops of trees. This is a mop brush. This was a gift to me from a good friend of mine. You'll notice it says it's faux squirrel. It has the texture of squirrel hair, but it is not squirrel hair. It's called a mop brush because it takes up a lot of water. And that makes it great for large washes such as skies or maybe the sides of buildings and things. This is a large sable brush, and I use this for nice big flat areas like the sides of buildings like I mentioned. This is probably my most expensive brush that I own. This is true sable, so it is sable hair, and again it works really well. This is a small detail brush. This is a Nik Pro 02. This is a nice to have thing. I have about 4 of these in different sizes, and they're fantastic for doing tiny little details. This is a number 2. I think it comes like in a 1 and a 0, and maybe even a 3 after that. Now let's talk some palettes. Palettes come in either plastic or ceramic form. This is my plastic palette, and to be honest, I don't use this as often. You can tell because some of the paints are kind of dried up. But the one thing I do like about the plastic palette is I was able to write with a permanent marker on the side specifically what each of the colors were. Now, the one thing about a plastic palette is that you need to scrub them a little bit because they tend to bubble up a little, and when you're mixing them, they bead up. And so we use a Mr. Clean eraser, and that over the top of it, and that helps the paint not to bead up on the plastic. And this is my current palette. This is a ceramic palette. I keep my warm colors on one side, my cool colors on the other side, and usually my neutral colors on the end. And then I have a nice large area for mixing, and I rarely clean it up. You can see on the side here, it is a Butcher tray, and it's from the company American Journey, so I highly recommend it. However, if you go and just buy you a ceramic plate, that will work just fine. Now with my ceramic palette, I always keep a list of where the colors are and what their names are so I can remember, always with a date. This one's a little bit out of date, so I need to update it some because I've added some colors. But you can see how I've written down the color and know their location so that when I'm doing a painting, I say, oh, where was alizarin crimson? There it was on the bottom. So knowing where they are is going to help you tremendously so that you don't mix the wrong color. Now let's talk watercolors. These are specific to different companies that I like. We have Winsor Newton, that's there on the right, and we have Daniel Smith that is on the left. The Winsor Newton tends to be a little bit cheaper, and they have a wide variety of colors. Now know that the color is specific to the company. So you might have one color from one company, another color from another company, and they might be a little bit different. Each tube of paint has the information on as far as what specific colors are mixed together to make that paint. So if you look at that, you'll be able to guess which paint to get from the other company. I currently use ceramic water containers. These are a nice to have things. The reason why I like these is just because they're ceramic. It supports an artist. But also, I have 2 of them, one for clean water, one for dirty water. And they keep my brushes on them so nicely with the little indentations, but they are great to have. You can just use plastic containers. This, again, a nice to have. This is my mechanical pencil. I had a friend of mine that was using one, and I asked him about it, and I decided to go ahead and get one. Again, this is a nice to have. The number 2 pencil will work just fine. Just make sure it's nice and sharp. Let's begin by looking at a sphere before we attempt to paint one. A sphere has several different areas of shading. First, you have the highlight, which will be on one side. You need to recognize where the light source is coming from. Second, you have the cast shadow, which is what we're probably most familiar with. It's the darkest of the areas. Also, you have a midtone. The midtone isn't really dark and it isn't real light. It's middle tone. So when you're thinking about value or the darkness, this would be the area that's the lightest. Then we have the core shadow, which gets a little bit darker than the midtone. And then there's a reflection highlight, which is on the other side of that midtone. As we prepare to paint, I have my paper taped down with my artist tape, and then I usually get the center of that artist tape and draw the circle. It's just much easier to draw it using a template of some kind instead of trying to draw it freehanded. I'm just choosing one color, and I'm choosing to use a blue here. It doesn't really matter what color you're using. And I'm using a flat brush so that it'll be easier for me to stroke on the color. Now the main thing first of all is to get just a first layer of paint down. You'll notice I have an area that I am not painting in. You're going to let that dry and then come back on with another layer. This is called glazing. You'll hear more about it later, and also when we're doing our paintings later. The flat brush is nice to get those edges nice and straight. Now what I'm doing is I am rinsing off my brush, drying it off, and then I'm rubbing it onto the paint to soften it, because some of the edges were very flattened and very straight, which is not natural in this situation. Coming in and doing my first layer of paint in the cast shadow. Same thing, taking my brush, rinsing it off, drying it off, and using that to soften the edges. Because an edge of a shadow is not completely flat or straight, especially down there on the end where it gets farther and farther away from the object that is casting the shadow. You can see this takes a little while, and it's nice. It gives a nice impression. All right, so by now the first layer and second layer of blue are dry, and now I'm coming in with my third layer. Every time that you add a layer, it gets darker, so keep that into consideration. The reason why we're adding all these layers is so that we have a very good impression of the softness on the edges of the shadows, but also so that that shadow on the edge of that sphere becomes even darker. So we can see there I have let it dry, and now I'm using a little bit darker blue. I believe I added some, just a tad of black to it to make it even darker. Not too much, I still want to be blue. Doing the same thing I've done before. Now remember, the paint is dry underneath. So when I'm doing this glazing, I am putting in where the darkest shadow on the sphere is going to be and bringing that out. Now I probably will lift some a little bit later on because I do have that reflection. Here I am taking the brush and I am rinsing it off, drying it off again, and softening that because this is a shadow. It's not paint on the sphere, it is a shadow on the sphere. So you want to be very careful about making those edges softer. I even like to dry brush it where I'm taking a little bit of paint on my brush that is dry, kind of just on the tip, and using that to paint with as well. Now I am lifting some because I'm looking and seeing where those highlights are that I need to make sure I show. So to lift it, I'm doing the same thing. I am wetting my brush, I am drying it off, and then I am scrubbing it in that area to lift up the paint. And that's a lot easier than trying to paint around it and make it lighter. You can't with watercolors, obviously you can't use a paint on top to make it lighter. You could use a white, but then it wouldn't look very well. But lifting is the best thing to do. Here I am lifting up there on the top, bringing it down a little bit. As I'm looking at the photo and seeing, okay, where is it lighter? Where does the shadow actually begin? Now this is where that highlight is there on the sphere, and it's not completely white. It has a little bit of a tint to it. So what I did was I took some of the paint from around using my dry brush method or using the lifting method, and I am going around it and kind of softening that edge. Now I'm taking even more darker paint. I added just a little bit more of the black, and this is going to create the really, really, really dark shadow. We'll talk more about techniques for creating those shadows and the colors that you use. Adding black is one technique, but you'll notice I'm not using pure black. I'm mixing that black with the color I'm using, with that blue, and that really helps make it look more natural because shadows are not black. They are a darker color of what they are cast on. Here we are softening that edge again to make it sure it looks more realistic. And as it's going out, it's going to get lighter. Rinsing my brush off, drying it off again, and softening those areas that are farther out. It's nice to keep a hairdryer handy. This is going to allow me to dry all of the painting, and then I can come back in with paint after I've dried it. And as you can see, this time I have darkened that blue even more with the black. And this is where that darkest of shadow is going to be. It's going to allow me to create that contrast. You can now see the contrast between the sphere and the darkest shadow, or the cast shadow. Now that I have the cast shadow painted and it's nice and dark, I need to come and adjust the edge so it's not quite such a high contrast. I need to do a glazing of that lighter area, and looking at the photo, it's a little bit lighter than what I'm wanting. So I continue to drag that paint out and soften it as I dry my brush down, wet it with some clean water, and then again softening that edge. And our painting of our sphere is complete. So I'm going to demonstrate 3 different techniques for creating the color that your shadow is going to be. And the first one we've seen in my previous demonstration, but it is adding black to create a shadow. And with this specific technique, there's several different colors you can use of paint. This is Mars Black. You can also use Neutral Tint and Payne's Gray. All 3 of them would be good choices. Even though I am mixing a black with the paint, I still want to do some glazing so that that color becomes even darker. And that's what I'm doing in this situation. I have this sketch done of these houses in perspective, and then there is a fence going along it that had some really interesting shadows from the tree that's next to it. So this is my first layer of paint. And just like in my previous demonstration, this is blue. And I believe this is mixed with the Mars Black. And I don't have a whole bunch of black in the blue because I wanted to do layering. Now, one thing that I like to do when I'm doing my sketches is if I have a shadow, I just usually do it with one line. It's perfectly okay to draw the exact width of that shadow, but I like to go ahead and have my brush do that for me. This is my Princeton brush, and my Princeton brush has a nice point on the edge of it, but I'm also able to adjust the thickness of my brush by pressing down so that the areas where the shadow is thicker, I can go ahead and make that adjustment. Here I am using my hair dryer again. I keep it right beside my table where I paint because it just is so handy. This is the second layer. Again, this is glazing. You can see how automatically it is getting darker. I did not add any more black paint to the paint that I mixed up. This is simply just adding the same color on top so that it gets darker. This is a technique that is nice to have because you don't have to change your paint in order to make it look darker in the painting. You just have to continue glazing and using the layers. And this is layer number 3. And you can see it almost looks black. However, it's still the mixture of blue and black. As I said earlier, shadows are not black. Shadows are a darker value of what they are on. And in this situation, I wanted to emphasize just mixing the two colors together as I did in the previous demonstration. Our second technique for mixing colors to create shadows with is analogous. Now, if we look at this color wheel, analogous colors are ones that are next to each other on the color wheel. This specific color wheel has green, blue, green, and blue. But in our situation, we're going to be using orange, red, violet, and red to put that all together. So for this painting, I'm doing a landscape that is a little bit of a hill. I'm going to start with the yellow. Now, the one thing about creating analogous color scheme is that some of it is a bit unrealistic. It's kind of fantasy looking. So this one is going to be mainly just oranges and reds and yellows. I'm trying to get the paper pretty much wet down so I can do some wet into wet in my trees. What wet into wet means is that the paper is wet and I've got the paint being just a little bit more wet than if I were going to be painting details. And you can see how that is making that fuzz out. That's going to help me in my shading later when I come back in and add some shadows. Now that my underpainting is dry, I'm coming back in with this time using my flat brush, and I'm adding some texture using the red, the darker red, and making some leaves. I'm also picking up some raw sienna. Raw sienna is actually a brown, but it has a lot of orange in it and yellows. So it's perfect for these trees, and the mixture of the raw sienna and the red together makes some nice shadows. So as I'm putting on these leaves on the trees, I'm thinking about the shadows and where they would be located. Also noting that this is a landscape, so the colors that are farther away are going to be a little bit more muted. They're not going to be as strong as this tree that's in the foreground. The next technique for utilizing colors with shadows is being able to mix complementary colors. Those are the ones that are across the color wheel from each other, such as orange and blue. We are going to be using red and green mixed together. When you mix the red and green together, you're going to end up with a brown. In fact, any time that you mix complements together, it's going to dull the colors way down. If you have a situation where the red is really bright, if you can just add a little bit of green to it, it will dull that color down so it's not quite so bright. In this situation, our house that is here is in the shade. So that's why I'm mixing those two colors together and then going ahead and painting it to make it look as though the house is in the shade and like the sun was coming in from the back. The first complete painting that we're going to be doing is this landscape. I chose this resource photo for two reasons. First of all, for the incredible shadows that are in the foreground. And second, for the light source that is in the background. I really like the way that the trees in the background are lighter than what you're seeing in the foreground. They get darker as they get closer to you. As I'm drawing and sketching, I'm just simply using a single line to show the details of the trees. And then when I come back in with my brush, I'll press it down and make them a little bit darker, similar to what you've seen me do before. I'm going to begin by mixing up cerulean blue and Payne's gray, and that's going to create a nice light gray for me to use in the sky. I've added water to it so that it's not very dark. And I want to do a couple layers of this just so that that gray will start to show. I'm using a flat brush because this flat brush allows me to cover the area pretty quickly. It also holds a lot more paint and I'm able to draw some more straight lines with it. The second color I'm going to mix up is a burnt sienna and quinacridone gold. This is a nice brown, a nice warm brown that will help me make the bushes and the trees that are in the background. I've added lots of water to it so that when I lay it down on the painting, it goes wet into wet. So you have the wet paper with the gray on it, and then you have the brown that laid down to make the bushes. Now I'm going to take that same color and I'm going to paint the foreground. And one thing you might notice is that I've left a white line in between the background and the middle ground and foreground. And that is so that when I lay down colors, that these two will not mix together. It creates almost like a dam between the two. Now I'm going to take that same gray mixture, the cerulean blue and the Payne's gray. I'm mixing it with a little bit of sap green. This is going to help me with the bushes and some of the vegetation that are there in the foreground. Taking a little bit of cerulean blue, I'm putting it at the top of the sky just to give the illusion of some clouds, and then I spritz them down with some water to kind of let them bleed out. Now letting this first layer in my landscape dry and using my hairdryer. Once it was dry, I'm going to add some water to that gray mixture that I created. And now I'm using my small detail brush. I'm checking to make sure that it's not too dark, because since these are the trees that are in the background, I do not want them to be really dark. I want them to dry lighter. Because of that light sources in the background, the value of these trees is going to be very light. Once I have that forest of small trees done, then I'm coming in with the gray and kind of emphasizing the path that comes around to the front of the foreground in the landscape. This just increases the contrast between the very light color that's in the foreground and just develops a little bit of texture that we're going to build up as we keep on going. One brush technique that I frequently use is to take the brush you're using and drag it sideways. Now the brush drags over the paper since this is cold press, and the texture of the paper shows through and allows you to develop even more texture. Now I have switched brushes and I'm using the silver black velvet, and with the silver black velvet I am able to paint the larger trees that are going to be in the background and in the foreground. With this brush I'm able to press down and get some more of the details. We're still keeping them very light value and maybe making a second coat on them, glaze on the top of what I already had, so they're not quite so light. With the silver black velvet's point on the end of the tip of the brush, just very helpful when doing these small, thin trees. As the trees in the middle ground and foreground have dried, I'm coming back into the background and adding a little bit more detail, making sure to use a light value of that same gray color. Now that I'm happy with the way the background looks, I'm ready to start working on the middle ground and the foreground, specifically the shadows. Holding my brush sideways, I'm able to create that texture on the ground that is created by the shadows and the way it picks up all the little details that are there. Now the important thing is to note that as these shadows get closer to me, they are a little bit lighter. There's also some areas where the sun is shining through, so it's going to be bright. Most importantly, we need to understand that we are not necessarily copying the photograph, if you haven't noticed that already. So the shadows that I'm painting in the foreground don't have to look exactly like the picture. Each one of the trees has a shadow that is coming down towards the foreground. One thing to note is the diagonals that are created. I'm also coming back in and I'm adding some darker shadows that are on top of the lighter shadows. And I'm kind of emphasizing that path one more time. For our still life, we're going to begin with a drawing, looking at the basic shapes and not including any of the details. So as I draw the apples, I'm thinking ovals, and I'm looking how they're overlapping, and I'm also including some of the wrinkles that are in the background in the fabric. The first color I want to start with is cadmium yellow. The reason why I'm starting with the yellow is because it's going to help me establish that underpainting that's going to be really necessary to make this really pop. The yellow starts out the highlight or the lighter part of the apple. So I need to remember where the light is coming from and look very closely to see where the lighter parts of the apple will be. Next, I want to consider the shading. Where is the shadow? And for that, I'm going to be using Winsor Violet. The reason why I'm using Winsor Violet is because it is a complementary color. You have violet, and then you have the yellow. The violet is a darker value, so it's going to help establish the shading in this situation. Let that dry with our hairdryer, and now we're getting into a more realistic color. This one is Rose Madder. It's a darker red, almost a red violet. And you'll notice what happens when you put one coat over the top of the other colors. This glazing effect is going to really help turn those yellows and those violets into a more realistic color, but it's also going to establish some depth. When the Rose Madder dries, then I'm coming in with a nice stronger red, the cadmium red. As you can see, when the Rose Madder dries, it looks more purple because of the violet underneath it. But glazing with the cadmium red is going to get a more realistic color. It's also going to start establishing those darker values, those shadows that we've kind of talked about already. In looking at the photograph, I'm noticing that there are some places that are almost too dark. So I am, first of all, lifting with a paper towel, and secondly, softening the edges with a damp brush like we've done before. Once that layer has dried, it's time to build up a little bit of detail by glazing cadmium red on top of what we've already done. Watercolor is all about layers. It's all about adding layer on top of layer to establish detail and to establish the shadow. This one I'm using my silver black velvet, so it's a nice point. And I'm looking closely at my photograph to see how the apple has grown. The apple has definite lines in it running from the center. And looking at our apple, there's definitely some green towards the center of where the stem is located. So I'm taking one of my detail brushes and I've mixed up a yellow green, a darker yellow green, to match the green that's on the apple. And using that detail brush, I'll be able to include more of the lines that make up the detail of the center of the apple. In order to build up the contrast, we're going to glaze on top of the green and on top of the red that is dried. And you will notice that when the red has dried, it's much lighter. It's almost a pink instead of a red. So to build up that detail and to build up that color, we're adding another glazing on top of it. Using some burnt umber, the next step is going to be to create some shadow and some contrast. And we're working on the centers where there is a dark shadow and also where the stem of the apple would be. But we can only see the stem in the apple that is facing us. My shadow in the center of the apple became too dark. So the best way to do that would be to lift up some of that color. I'm also lifting up so that you can see the stem a little bit better. And once this dries, I'll come back over it and add some of the burnt umber for more detail. Looking at my reference photo, I realized that I was missing the cadmium yellow, missing the yellow that was on the side of one of the apples. So I included that in, and now I'm continuing to blend the colors together and to continue making that red darker. Just as in with our landscape, it was important for me to darken some of the shadows, and for this I'm using the burnt umber, placing it only in locations where I'm seeing a very dark shadow, and then taking my brush and blending that in. As with any watercolor painting and using layers, glazing plays such an important part. And for our still life, it allows us to make a nice deep dark red apple. It also allows us to create those varying shades of the different colors. So taking that dark cadmium red and then blending it together over the dark part of the apple. Drying the apples one last time to make sure that they are all dry, and then I can work on adding highlights and also the background. Here in the finished painting, you can see where I have used a gray to make the shadows in the fabric, but most important, I used a white gouache to show the highlights on the apples. It just makes the highlights pop and finishes up the details very nicely. I hope that you found this class informative and that you will try out some of the techniques that I've demonstrated for you in this video. So I have 3 questions for you to kind of review some of the things that we've talked about. Question number 1, what are 2 of the color schemes artists use to create values for shading? That would be the color schemes that were on the color wheel. Number 2, what is glazing? How is it used to create shading? And number 3, why is underpainting important when creating shading? What was an example that I used when I painted the apple still life? So what are the 2 color schemes artists use to create values for shading? Complementary color scheme, which is across from each other, and analogous color scheme, which is next to each other. What is glazing? How is it used to create shading? Glazing is when you allow a layer of paint to dry and then the paint layer on top. So you put one layer on top of another. And what that does is create a darker value of that specific color. Why is the underpainting important when creating shading? What was the example used in painting apples? Underpainting basically creates a base coat of paint and it makes the colors richer and the shadows have a greater contrast. The apples I painted, I used yellow and violet. Now my challenge to you is to pick up those paint brushes, get that paint handy, and try some of the techniques that I've demonstrated. Have a wonderful day.